Happy Monday, everyone. Again, for those who might not know, my name is Eric Molendyk. I'm the national coordinator for Tetra, and I also have the privilege of being the coordinator of the Vancouver chapter. And today we are kind of doing a get to know your Tetra volunteers, and I am privileged to be here or interviewing. Of course, everybody's working from home, including volunteers. So I'm interviewing today Glenn Parker. Hello, Glenn.
Hello, Eric.
So Glenn is a very active and vital part of the Vancouver chapter. And Glenn and I were just talking. So Glenn, you figure that you've been a part of Tetra for about 4 years?
I just looked. It looks like I did my first project in mid-2016. So 4 years is the right number.
And how did you first hear about Tetra?
I have a daughter that's an occupational therapist. I retired in around the time that I started with Tetra. My daughter said, hey, there's a group that might be able to use some of your skills. And so I looked up Tetra and sent in my application and was asked to a meeting. And when I got there, I was delighted to find a neighbor of mine was also at the meeting. And he was a very active Tetra member. His name's Ron Payne. And so now he's just down the block, and we started, I do projects, and if I have problems, Ron has a really nice shop. And there's another fellow in our neighborhood called Wayne Maddock, who's a welder, and he helps us when we need to have help. And it's a way to socialize and help people at the same time.
Yes, I'm going to tell you a little secret. When your application came across, because as you know, OTs are so valuable and also helping determine what's available commercially and stuff. So here you were. Now you have a mechanical engineering background.
Civil, but
civil.
It's all the same.
Yeah, so you have the engineering background. You had access to a workshop, and your daughter was an OT. And so my colleague at the time, Pat Tweedy, she referred to you as Mr. Perfect, a perfect candidate for Tetra. And you come up with just great solutions, and there's volunteers that do projects all over Vancouver, but there's kind of what I call the North Shore crew, and you guys will meet up and do projects together. And as you said, and your neighborhood is quite a ingenious neighborhood you live in. People with common interests helping people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things you're also into is fishing. You like fishing quite a bit. And I have seen you solve a number of Tetra solutions with fishing gear. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I do fish. That's a true statement. I obviously tinker with my boat and various rigging and whatnot. And some of the problems that you have to solve to manage fishing gear, because you don't have hands for everything, are somewhat applicable to people in a chair or with some disability. So you're just trying to figure out things that that'll work to be an extra set of hands, or control something that you don't have time to do because your attention's somewhere else.
And the other thing that you've showed is fishing rod holders can make great holders for other things.
Well, that's great. If you think about a boat and you have fishing rods, and they have to mount on a gunnel, mount on a seat. They have to hold this device or that device. They have to be able to swing through various arcs. And again, that's really quite applicable to somebody, particularly on a motorized chair, because they want their stuff at hand, but they still want to be able to be free to do other things. And yeah, I think there's one that's called the Scotty bait cutting table, which is an ideal platform for all kinds of things on a motorized wheelchair.
And of course, speaking of motorized chairs, this is a fun project. One of our clients is younger and a teenager, and togetherness is really important. And you help modify his scooter with a ride-along step. That's one of your projects. I remember that was quite popular.
Yeah, that was that one has a whole bunch of interesting dimensions to it. One is the original request came in is that this client had a motorized trike, and this thing was super powerful, could go 50, 70 kilometers an hour. and he used it to go all over Vancouver. And he had actually crashed it just before the project was to start. And the project was to be able to make it so he could carry his manual chair or tow it behind this trike. And so first thing we had to do was actually fix this crashed unit, which had some bent parts and broken parts and whatnot. And we fixed that and whatnot. And then we made the hitch to tow the trailer. So that was pretty interesting. But the thing that kind of was a bit different was this was a motorized trike built for off-road mountain biking. And this thing had acceleration. It was the Tesla of tricycles. When I fixed it and put it out for a test run, I was afraid I couldn't stop. This thing accelerated so fast, you just sat back in your seat and whoop. So then, just before we turned it over to back to the client and his father, Ron said, this, and well, actually, they'd said that they weren't going to be able to get help with the insurance claim because this thing is so powerful, it should be registered as a motor vehicle. And so then Ron says, well, it's not registered. You fixed it, and this thing goes like crazy again. Are we doing something we shouldn't do? So then what I did is I figured out how the control system worked, and the control system had limits on it. And you could set the maximum speed and the point of acceleration and the maximum, well, they call them watts, but the maximum power. So I detuned it to be a street legal electric bicycle. And then I sent it back to them, and I said to the father, I said, like, I can give this thing back to you. It's like a rocket ship. And the father said, that's okay. And a little while went by, and the father phones back, and he said, like, how did you deprogram that thing? Where did you find the instructions? And I said, well, I went online and I found some instructions about how to program it. And I think it wasn't long after that, I think I got communication that they'd worked on it themselves. And I see, Eric, that in our list of projects, they have another project. I think he's got a new wheelchair and he needs another adapter for the back of it.
Yes.
Interesting how we approach that.
Yeah. So the moral of the story that I'm going to take away is that Tetra believes in safety first. And I'm going to see if I can pull up pictures that you shared. Do you see it on my screen there?
Yes, I do. So that's the hitch that was made that hooks to the back of this tricycle. And you can see just a picture of the manual wheelchair off to the side there. It's basically a frame, hooks onto the back fork, and a little hitch mechanism.
And then this is the bike itself.
Yeah, no, that bike, if you go online and Google it and see some of the videos about how they use it, it is remarkable.
Yeah, well, this was for a client who struggles with energy and fatigue. And so being able to walk was difficult for him. And being a younger guy, he wanted to get out there. And as Glenn said, Glenn and Ron turned down the speed to keep it safe. Because I remember when this project came up, I was all about the safety first.
Yeah. So what the father said is when they wanted to retune it, is that they live right close to the university endowment lands, and he goes on the trails. And when it was detuned, it couldn't climb the hills and do what it was meant to do. So it's kind of a iffy thing, on the road, they limit the power and the speed, but if you're off road, you want the power and the speed. So
it's kind of like a power chair. You adjust the speed as you need to.
Yeah.
Now, in your time of making projects, you were just mentioning to me you're up to about 40 projects now.
Right. I try and do, one a month or so.
Yes. So is there a certain material that you find you use more often in projects than others?
Well, that's a good question, Eric, because we have a range of skills in Tetra. We have guys that are good on control systems, and we have different guys. I tend to do things in aluminum, more mechanical, pulleys, winches, pins, making brackets, carriers, that kind of stuff, paint easels. But anyway, I tend to work in light metals and fabricate things that either somebody can pull up to and use, or it can be attached to a device. I think the last project I did was a family had one very son, he was about 8 years old, in a small wheelchair, and they just had a newborn baby in a stroller, and the mother wanted to go out with both of them at one time, couldn't control all the things, so we just made a device that the stroller hooked on into the front of the chair, and the mother then pushed the chair with the one fellow in it, and then had the stroller with the baby in it in front. And that was a fun thing, but it was just, again, making some brackets out of aluminum and fitting the two devices together. So I'd say I think I take the more simpler projects from Tetra and kind of punch them out. Usually my projects are, I don't know, 10 hours or something work. There's other people that take a lot more complex projects that take more time, but I tend to go after the smaller ones. I like to visit the people. I like to talk to them.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of really nice people associated with Tetra and the Disabilities Association, and it's really nice. I kind of also got into it a little bit. My brother-in-law had MS, and he's just recently passed away. But as he progressed with that disease, we kept making different devices to try and help him. And some of the stuff that I did with my brother-in-law were right off the wall. He had things like his leg wouldn't work, so made a bungee cord that hooked from his belt down to his toe, and it lifted his leg each time he kind of shifted. And we had things in his canoe, and we had things on his stroller, you name it. He had a good imagination, and we just put things together whenever we needed to.
Well, Glenn, some of the projects may seem simple to you, but I can guarantee they make a world of difference to a user. A simple project that you did that I know had great impact to many was we got a request run time from a sledge hockey team. And for those who don't know, sledge hockey, they're very competitive, and they get playing, on the ice. And their version of hockey is like any other version. You can bump into one another, and sometimes the sleds would tip over. And you made a slight modification to help that enabled them to get the sleds right side up by one person.
Yeah, that was a funny one. I went there to a game, watched them, and they're struggling, and these sleds are kind of not that rigid, so they bend, and of course the disabled person is strapped into the sled and they can't get out. A lot of them don't have the strength to push them up. So at the end, it basically made a little pry bar that hooked underneath the sled on one side of the one rail and hooked on the other, and the referee just carried the pry bar with him, and if somebody flipped over, he'd skate over, slide it under the sled, give it a lift, and then that person in the game went on. That one was rewarding because typically if somebody tips over, the game slows right down because the game has to stop while they right the other one. With the ref, with this little, basically a pry bar, he could right the player in, as fast as he could skate over there, he'd flip him up in 5 or 10 seconds. And so the game picked up a lot of speed, and they really liked it because it sped up the game.
Yeah. And the last project I wanted to mention, I thought it was fitting because here we are communicating by video, and you completed a project for a fellow in Smithers, and you designed everything, and he saw your concepts all by Skype or by video.
Yeah, that was interesting. At first, I think when the project started, he was down in Vancouver at GF Strong. And then by the time I guess we got organized and whatnot, he'd moved back up to Smithers. And he was a doctor up there. And he was a GP, but he retrained himself to be a oncologist, I think it is. But he basically would review a whole bunch of cancer tests and then write reports. So he needed a mechanism to be able to access his iPad, but also his rehabilitation required that he get up and down regularly. So anyway, we fiddled around with his chair, we added some devices and whatnot, and anyway, he seemed real happy at the end. It was done a bit virtually because I would build something and then I'd send him a video of it, and then I'd build something else and I'd send him a video, and we'd talk that way, and he'd send me parts by mail. I got parts of his chair by mail to come down to me, and then I'd fiddle with those parts and then send him another video. And then eventually he came down to Vancouver, and he was staying, is it Ronald McDonald House? But anyway, over on Cambie or something, there's a place, and so then we had all the parts, so we went over to his hospice that he was at and put it all together, and he took it all home to Smithers, and the project was done.
Yeah, well, that's what I remember is you did these little video tutorials and you would show him how you hoped it would work, and then he would get back to you after seeing the video and say yes or no, and you guys were able to connect. Uh, well, Glenn, it's been an awesome 4 years seeing what you come up with. You're a great problem solver, and I thank you for the time and kind of sharing how you got involved with Tetra, and I'll always be indebted to your daughter for mentioning it. And I'm glad you get to work with your neighbor Ron. And thanks so much for doing all the devices and all the projects.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
You too.